Hello to everyone and welcome back to Be Like Christ. We are in Nehemiah chapter 2 today. I hope everyone got enough introductory information in chapter 1. You can download our hopefully informative PDFs on our website at tobelikechrist.com if you would like them. Let's begin by talking about our timeline. Where are we in history as Nehemiah chapter 2 picks up? So we discussed in the last chapter that around 538, Cyrus, who conquered the Babylonians, allowed the Jews to return to Judah and Jerusalem and to start rebuilding. They spent some time rebuilding the temple. We also talked about Ezra's work in reforming the marriages of the people of Judah at the end of the book of Ezra. And now we're picking up with this guy named Nehemiah, who he himself travels to Jerusalem around 444 BC. So that's where we are, about 444 BC. And this is about, 13 years after Ezra arrived in Jerusalem. And it's about 90 to 100 years after the Jews were initially allowed to go back. So they've been in Jerusalem for like 90 to 100 years. But as we talked about in the last chapter, the state of Jerusalem is really not good. In terms of our key historical characters for this chapter, the first one is a group of people, the Jews. These are the descendants of the tribes of Israel. They had been in Babylonia for 70 years as captives, but they've finally been allowed to return. And as I mentioned, they've been slowly rebuilding the city of Jerusalem for several decades now. We have Nehemiah, who is a descendant of the tribes of Israel. He is a Jew, but he lives in Susa, which is the capital of the Persian Empire. He's not going to live there for much longer, but our next historical figure is Artaxerxes Longimanus. He is the king of Persia from 464 to 424 BC. We talked about him in the story of Ezra. I'm going to talk about him again. And now Sanballat and Tobiah. Boo. We don't like them. These are the enemies of Nehemiah and the Jews who oppose the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Our map is going to be basically the same as what we discussed in chapter 1. Nehemiah lives in Susa, all the way over there on the east side of the map. He's going to be making the 900 or so mile journey to Jerusalem over on the west side of the map near the Mediterranean Sea. All right, so we have 20 verses total in this chapter. Section number 1 is verses 1 through 8. Ezra asks Artaxerxes for permission to go to Jerusalem. So these events take place about 4 months after Nehemiah received the news about the sad state of Jerusalem at the beginning of chapter 1. Nehemiah was working as the king's cupbearer one day, and the king noticed that he was kind of sad. He was downcast. And after being asked the reason, Nehemiah said, "Well, how can I help but be sad? Because the great city of my people, Jerusalem, is essentially lying in ruins." Well, Artaxerxes figured out what Nehemiah really wanted, and that was to go back to Jerusalem. So he gives him leave to go back to Jerusalem and to rebuild the city. And he also gives him permission to use the trees, the timbers in the royal forest, and help in rebuilding the city gates, the city walls, and the houses of Jerusalem. From verse 9 to verse 18, we are in section number 2, Nehemiah and the walls of Jerusalem. Nehemiah traveled to Jerusalem with the king's blessing and with a group of officers and horsemen who accompanied him. He announced his arrival to kind of the governors of the region, the governors of the province beyond the river, as it was called, with a letter from Artaxerxes. But not everyone was so happy to see him, even though he had the king's blessing. 2 men, Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite, were angry that someone had, quote, come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel, according to verse 10. After being in Jerusalem for 3 days, Nehemiah went out at night and he started to inspect the walls of the city. It says that he went from the valley gate to the dragon spring, to the dung gate, to the fountain gate, and then to the king's pool. Now, if you have no idea where those are, which I didn't when I was doing this, hold on for our Nehemiah 3 study where we're going to have a special map of Jerusalem to at least give us kind of an idea of where some of these gates are and kind of what the city of Jerusalem may have looked like during that time. So he goes out and he inspects the city walls. And afterwards, Nehemiah gathers the priests, the nobles, the officers of the city, and he told them that he wanted to organize the people to rebuild these crumbling walls. Nehemiah was confident that he had the Lord's blessing, that the Lord was going to assist him in this process, and he shared with the officers how Artaxerxes had given him permission to use the trees of the forest. So they have supplies, they have the king's blessing. The Jews were inspired by Nehemiah's leadership and this new energy that he was bringing to the city, and they responded positively, saying, "Let us rise up and build." So great, we've got a new temple, and now we're going to have some new walls in Jerusalem. Progress is being made. Well, not so fast. We've got some opposition in verses 19 and 20. Sanballat and Tobiah, boo, are going to get in the way. As soon as the Jews mobilized to build, these guys named Sanballat and Tobiah and some others mocked them, and they tried to frame them as rebels against the king of Persia. Now, how did Nehemiah respond to this? Essentially, Nehemiah told them to go away and to mind their own business because he knew that he was doing things according to Artaxerxes' orders, that he wasn't doing anything wrong, and Sanballat and Tobiah had no business interfering with what happened in Jerusalem. So that's our quick summary of chapter 2. Now let's talk about this false framing that's being done by the enemies of the Jews in our application section. False framing is an age-old tactic of the devil's servants. If you're working hard, if you're motivating people in God's kingdom, you will face opposition, and your opponents will often try to frame you in an unfavorable light. And they do this probably for a couple reasons: to get other people to doubt you, to doubt your authenticity, to doubt your genuineness, and also probably to get you to doubt yourself. If you hear something repeated long enough, you might start thinking, well, maybe I'm not the man who needs to be leading. Maybe I'm not the woman who needs to be taking on this responsibility. Maybe I am some of these things that people are repeating about me. Strong leaders are very often framed as proud, domineering, as change agents, as rebels, or as having ulterior motives. And I heard, interestingly, actually, it was in a political discussion of a politician talking about how this tactic is used in at least American politics. You repeat a lie enough times, and certain people will start to believe it after a while, and they'll start to think that there's some legitimacy to it. And so you can kind of smear people by just coming up with a lie and then kind of putting it out there into public repeatedly. And all of a sudden, the leader who was pure of heart, the people start questioning him and thinking, oh, maybe he's not who he says he is. Maybe he's not as genuine and as godly as he says that he is. But Nehemiah, he shows us a good example here. He knew why he came to Jerusalem. He knew that he came there to do God's work. He knew that he wasn't a rebel against Persia, as they were trying to frame him as being. So he just dismissed their critiques, and he went back to work. Strong leaders, good leaders, wholesome leaders, they need to know their own hearts and be confident in the purity of their motives. This will allow them to dismiss baseless claims, to protect themselves against doubting themselves and doubting the mission that God has given them. And so they need to dismiss these baseless claims, not deal with these people who are liars, to kind of just push them off to the side, and then to get back to work doing the important work that God has entrusted them with. So there you have it. That is our study in Nehemiah chapter 2 today. Lord willing, we'll be back to see some wall rebuilding in chapter 3 tomorrow.